On July 4th, 1946, on the hill of Biskupia Gorka near Gdansk, 200,000 people climbed before dawn. At the top, 5 women were placed standing on the back of a truck, each with a rope around their neck attached to the gallows above. The truck moved forward, and one by one they were executed. They were not soldiers or commanders, they were concentration camp guards, and each one had killed on her own before arriving there. Before they climbed those gallows, these women had dragged children by the hair to the gas chamber trucks. They had released starving dogs on prisoners who tried to crawl to drink water. They chose, with a gesture of the hand, who lived and who died that day. They were not monsters from fiction. They were ordinary women who found in the camps what they were truly seeking: power without limits and without consequences. In the next few minutes, you will meet each of these women, where they came from, what they did, and how the world responded. The SS recruited female guards with simple advertisements: good salary, housing, stability. Approximately 500 women accepted between 1939 and 1945. What nobody advertised was what would come next. Within weeks, these women learned to beat prisoners during roll calls in the cold, to use dogs as weapons, and to select who would be sent to the gas chamber. And they also learned that whoever did this most efficiently would be promoted faster. The training took place at Ravensbrück, the largest women's camp in Germany. The recruits learned practical torture techniques: how to strike without leaving visible marks, how to use the whip during appels, how to keep prisoners standing for hours in the cold until some collapsed. The instructors were experienced guards. They encouraged cruelty as an evaluation criterion. Those who hesitated were passed over. Those who showed natural brutality were recognized as promising. Ravensbrück was founded in 1939, about 56 miles from Berlin, specifically for women. More than 130 Sausener Oeslern prisoners from 30 countries passed through it between 1939 and 1945. Approximately 30 Oeslern did not leave alive. The gas chamber arrived in 1944 and killed approximately 500 women in the months it operated before the end of the war. Survivors of Ravensbrück described the daily routine with disturbing precision. Guards woke the prisoners at 3 in the morning for roll calls that lasted until dawn. Anyone who fainted was beaten on the ground. Meals were served with deliberate insufficiency, fewer calories than the body needs to survive. Collective punishments were applied for minimal individual infractions. And in the midst of all this, certain guards circulated with a smile, choosing who to beat next. Inside the camps, the Offizierinnen had the power of life and death over the prisoners without needing to justify anything to anyone. They could beat on the spot, release dogs, pull any woman from the line and send her to the gas chamber. There was no appeal, there was no witness who could speak. The records themselves show guards who systematically exceeded what any order required. For pleasure, for boredom, for ambition. The system did not create robots. It created perpetrators with autonomy. The guards who stood out at Ravensbrück for their brutality were not punished. They were promoted. The best executors received insignia, better salaries, and transferred to the extermination camps in the east. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Majdanek, Stutthof. That is how women trained to beat came to supervise selections on the arrival ramps, choosing who would go to the gas chambers. The system did not corrupt good people. It selected, rewarded, and exported the worst. Irma Grese was born on October 7, 1923, in Recken, Germany. Daughter of a milkman, she joined the League of German Girls as a teenager and became a trainee guard at Ravensbrück at 18 years old. Her progress was rapid. At 19, she was already at Auschwitz-Birkenau supervising thousands of prisoners. Survivor accounts are unanimous. She was young, ordinary in appearance, and relentlessly sadistic. Her superiors considered her one of the most efficient guards in the camp. At Auschwitz, Irma Grese carried a leather whip that rarely left her hand. She wore heavy boots and carried a pistol at her waist. Survivors describe how she selected victims from the ranks, beat them until they lost consciousness, and sometimes returned later to continue. She kept poorly fed dogs that she released on weakened prisoners. The sadism was not merely tolerated by the SS, it was admired by her superiors, who considered her a model of efficiency for the others. Irma Grese personally participated in the selections on the ramps of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the process in which new arrivals were divided between those who would work and those who would go directly to the gas chambers. She signaled with her head or a hand gesture, and men, women, and children went to the left or to the right without knowing what each direction meant. Witnesses state that she performed these selections with a bored expression, as if it were a routine bureaucratic task. Survivors of Auschwitz reported that Irma Grese held nighttime roll calls at 3 in the morning, leaving the prisoners standing for hours in the cold. Anyone who fainted was beaten. On several occasions, she walked through the ranks with a lantern, choosing women for degrading labor. Witnesses mentioned that she clearly delighted in the pain of others. The young woman who had entered the system at 18 had become, at 21, one of the most feared guards in the entire Auschwitz structure. In September 1944, Irma Grese was transferred to Bergen-Belsen. The camp transformed into a zone of chaos and epidemics. The conditions were so extreme that prisoners were dying of typhus and starvation by the hundreds each day. Grese continued her practices: beatings, dogs, arbitrary punishments, in an environment where bodies accumulated in the courtyards because there was no infrastructure to remove them. Bergen-Belsen was where British soldiers found her on April 15, 1945, when they liberated the camp. The Belsen trial in Lüneburg in 1945 was one of the first war crimes proceedings. Irma Grese was accused by dozens of survivors. Each testimony described the same woman: the whip, the dogs, the smile. She was 21 years old during the trial. Her lawyer argued obedience to orders. The survivors described with precision the voluntary cruelty, the deliberate excess, what went far beyond any order received. She was sentenced to death by hanging. The trial of Irma Grese revealed something disturbing beyond her crimes. She was not the exception. Dozens of other Auschwitz guards committed similar crimes, but the majority were never tried. They married, changed their names, and lived decades in silence. What made Grese notorious was the combination of her youth with the documented scale of her atrocities. For the survivors who testified, seeing her convicted was merely a fragment of justice in an ocean of structural impunity. The oldest of the three convicted at Hamelin had worked as a domestic servant for decades before joining the SS. Juana Borman served at Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and Bergen-Belsen. In each camp, the pattern repeated: the dogs. She used German Shepherd dogs as an instrument of terror, releasing them on weakened prisoners who could barely defend themselves. The nickname she received was the woman with the dogs. Bergen-Belsen, where Borman served until liberation in 1945, was technically a transit camp. But by the end of the war, the conditions there were of absolute catastrophe. Prisoners arrived in a state of advanced starvation, and typhus epidemics killed hundreds per day. Borman, with her dogs, patrolled the overcrowded spaces. Survivors describe how she released the animals on women who tried to crawl to get water or food, watching the bites with visible satisfaction. At the Belsen trial in 1945, Juana Borman was confronted with direct testimony from survivors. One witness stated having seen her order a dog to attack a woman to death and watch the process without intervening. Another described similar scenes with variations that reinforced the credibility of the accounts. Borman did not deny the dogs, but consistently minimized the violence. The tribunal considered the evidence sufficient for conviction, and she received the death sentence. The third woman convicted on that December 13th had a different history. She did not use dogs. She did not scream. Elisabeth Volkenrath was methodical. After years at Auschwitz, where she reached the rank of Oberaufseherin, she was transferred to Bergen-Belsen in 1945. On the arrival ramps, she chose prisoners for work or gas chamber as if she were sorting merchandise. No visible emotion, just the hand pointing left or right. At Bergen-Belsen, Elisabeth Volkenrath supervised guards and prisoners until the arrival of the British. When the camp was liberated, she did not flee. She was arrested the same day. Her trial included dozens of testimonies describing arbitrary beatings, participation in selections, and indifference to mass mortality. She admitted part of her actions, but classified them as obedience to orders. The tribunal considered the evidence sufficient. She was sentenced to death at 26 years old. The simultaneous execution of Irma Grese, Juana Borman, and Elisabeth Volkenrath on December 13, 1945, marked a historic point in post-war trials. 3 women executed for the same crime, on the same day, by the same executioner. Albert Pierrepoint carried out all 3 in less than an hour. The event demonstrated that the Allies would apply to women the same sentence as to men for the same crimes. It was a statement of principle. It was also just 3, in a system that had involved thousands. Not all perpetrators were executed. Some did not even come close. Ilse Koch had worked as a secretary before the war. In 1936, she married Karl Otto Koch, future commandant of Buchenwald. Ilse was not an official guard, but she lived inside the camp. Prisoners called her the Witch of Buchenwald. She rode on horseback with a whip in hand, beating anyone she encountered along the way without any pretext or provocation that could minimally justify the violence exercised against the inmates. Buchenwald was located near Weimar, the city of Goethe, a symbol of high German culture. The irony was noted by the prisoners themselves. A few miles from the cradle of classical culture operated one of the most brutal camps of the Reich. Ilse managed her life there like a perverse aristocrat. She had children, received guests, organized parties. Meanwhile, prisoners died of hunger and forced labor. Her unrestricted freedom of movement through the camp made her a constant danger to everyone. The crime that made Ilse Koch world famous was the alleged collection of articles made from the tattooed skin of murdered prisoners: lampshades, bindings, personal artifacts. After the war, the accusation was partially contested. Some items were identified as animal leather, but the testimonies about systematic murders of tattooed prisoners for skin removal were considered credible enough to compose the formal charges in the 2 trials Koch faced. Ilse Koch was sentenced to life in prison in 1947. In 1948, American General Lucius Clay reduced her sentence to 4 years, citing lack of evidence. The decision generated international outrage. An American senator called it a scandal of justice. Under political pressure, Koch was retried by a German court and reconvicted to life in prison in 1951. The case became a symbol of the failures in the application of war justice and the difficulty of prosecuting female complicity in the Holocaust. After the reconviction, Ilse Koch remained imprisoned in Eichach, Bavaria. In 1967, at 61 years old, she was found dead in her cell. She left a letter saying she had no more reason to live. Her youngest son, conceived at Buchenwald, was then 21 years old and did not yet know who his mother really was. The case of Ilse Koch was one of the first to test the post-war world's capacity to prosecute female complicity in the crimes of the Holocaust. The test failed at central points. The legacy of Ilse Koch goes beyond her personal crimes. She demonstrated how marriage to a perpetrator could give a woman lethal power over thousands of lives without needing an official rank. The Nazi system did not only create institutional guards, it also created an environment where women connected to power could exercise violence with total impunity. Koch was not an exception. She was the most visible among many commandant wives who made similar choices and never answered for them. Hermine Braunsteiner spent nearly 20 years living in Queens, New York as a housewife. The neighbors knew her as Hermine Ryan. Before that, in Majdanek, they called her the Mare. Her career began at Ravensbrück, where she quickly gained a reputation for exceptional brutality. She was known for beating prisoners with heavy boots. In 1942, she was transferred to Majdanek. It was at that camp where her crimes would reach a documented scale of extermination. Majdanek, on the outskirts of Lublin in occupied Poland, was one of the few camps where gas chambers, execution chambers, and crematoria coexisted in an integrated structure. Hermine Braunsteiner supervised the women's block. Survivors report that she appeared at appels with a whip and an expression of enthusiasm. She chose women for forced labor or gas chamber with random criteria: height, teeth, facial expression. Any detail served to decide who would die. The most documented crimes of Braunsteiner at Majdanek involved children. When transports of Jewish families arrived, the children were separated from their mothers. Witnesses describe how she dragged children by the hair to the trucks that took them to the gas chambers. One survivor reported that Braunsteiner threw a child to the ground and kicked her repeatedly while a line of women was forced to watch, motionless, under threat of being immediately selected. With the Soviet advance in 1944, Braunsteiner fled to Austria. In 1949, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison, a minimal sentence given the documented crimes. After serving it, she lived in Vienna without being bothered. In 1958, she emigrated to the United States and married an engineer named Russell Ryan, taking the name Hermine Ryan. She lived in Queens as a suburban housewife, completely unknown to the neighbors. For nearly 2 decades, the world simply forgot her. In 1964, Simon Wiesenthal located Hermine Braunsteiner in the United States and reported her whereabouts to the German government. In 1973, she became the first former war criminal extradited from the United States. The process revealed that the American government had known about her past since she applied for naturalization in 1963, but approved it anyway. The discovery generated a political scandal and forced a review of American immigration procedures. The forgetting, it became clear, had been convenient for many. The Majdanek trial in Dusseldorf between 1975 and 1981 was the longest war crimes trial in German history. 6 years of sessions, dozens of survivors testifying. Braunsteiner denied the crimes, but was confronted with documents and precise testimonies. In 1981, she was sentenced to life in prison. She spent her last years in a wheelchair, imprisoned in Aachen. She died in 1999, at 79 years old, still serving the sentence. The mayor of Majdanek never asked for forgiveness. While Braunsteiner lived decades free in the United States, another guard trained in the same system had gone straight to the scaffold. Dorothea Binz joined Ravensbrück at 19 years old and built a reputation for systematic cruelty. She was known for roaming the bunker, the punishment block of the camp, beating the prisoners in isolation. A disturbing characteristic of Dorothea Binz was her relationship with the guard Edmund Browning. The two were lovers and had the habit of taking walks through the camp on days off, pushing and beating prisoners they encountered along the way. Survivors described this ritual as entertainment for the couple. The two laughed while striking women weakened by hunger, cruelty as a leisure program, the concentration camp as recreational space for the most brutal guards. With the need for extermination on a larger scale, Ravensbrück received an improvised gas chamber in 1944. Dorothea Binz supervised part of the selections that fed this chamber. Survivors report that she appeared on the ramps when new transports arrived, helping to separate women unfit for work. The selected ones were taken in a truck covered with a tarp. Binz accompanied them with a routine expression, as if it were just another ordinary administrative task of the shift. Dorothea Binz was arrested in May 1945. Tried at the Ravensbrück trial in Hamburg in 1946, she faced dozens of survivors who identified her as the author of beatings, torture, and selections for the gas chamber. In her few statements, She admitted to having beaten prisoners, but classified the acts as necessary discipline for maintaining order. She was sentenced to death. On May 2, 1947, Dorothea Binz was hanged at Hamelin. She was 26 years old. Die Bestie, the beast. That was what her contemporaries called the Lagerführerin of Auschwitz-Birkenau. Maria Mandl held the highest position ever held by a woman at that camp, with direct command over dozens of guards and tens of thousands of prisoners. The nickname was not a metaphor. It was a literal description of her daily behavior. At Auschwitz, Maria Mandl controlled the women's block with direct physical violence and calculated psychological threats. She participated in selections on the ramps, determining who would work and who would go to the gas chambers. Survivors report that she walked through the camp with her hands behind her back, stopping suddenly to choose a prisoner and order immediate punishment for minimal infractions. An incorrect fold in the blanket, an open button, a look considered too insolent. Anything served. One of the most documented episodes about Maria Mandl involves the Auschwitz Orchestra, a musical ensemble formed by prisoners who played while the inmates marched to work. Mandel created the orchestra and used it as an instrument of privilege and punishment. Music was played while women marched to the gas chambers. Survivors of the orchestra described the specific horror. They were forced to play with enthusiasm while the smoke from the crematorium rose against the sky of Birkenau. With the Nazi retreat in 1944, Maria Mandl was transferred to Mühldorf in Bavaria. Captured by the Americans in 1945 and extradited to Poland, she was tried by the Supreme National Tribunal. Dozens of Auschwitz survivors traveled to testify against her. In each testimony, the same pattern. The woman who walked through the camp choosing who lived and who died with hand gestures. Maria Mandl was sentenced to death and hanged on January 24, 1948. She was 35 years old. The problem of dilution of guilt, because thousands participated in the system, each individual claimed their contribution was minimal. But the testimonies always revealed the same pattern. There were guards who did only the minimum required, and there were those who went far beyond, by their own will, with visible pleasure, without any specific order. This distinction was documented, unequivocal, and central to the processes of individual accountability. No group made this more evident than the 5 guards of Stutthof, sentenced to death in the same trial on the same morning. Before the war, she posed for fashion magazines in Hamburg and aspired to a career as an actress. In 1944, Jenny Wanda Barkman answered the SS advertisement and was accepted as a guard at Stutthof, near Gdansk. There was no simple logic in the transition. The woman who had posed for fashion magazines now supervised prisoners in a structure designed to kill. Colleagues described her as unstable, unpredictable, and deliberately cruel to the women under her guard. At Stutthof, Jenny Barkman became known as Mad Jenny. She beat prisoners with objects at hand, sent sick women to the gas chamber on her own initiative, and participated in selections with apparent enthusiasm. Survivors describe how she sometimes laughed during the beatings. Other prisoners who spotted her tried to change direction to avoid her. Her behavior was considered extreme even by the standards of the camp, where brutality was the rule. With the Soviet advance in early 1945, Stutthof began a brutal evacuation process. Prisoners were marched toward the Baltic Sea, where many were executed by firing squad upon reaching the coast. Jenny Barkman fled during the chaos of the evacuations, trying to blend in with the civilian population of Gdansk. Her image was in the camp archives, and detailed descriptions were distributed to Allied authorities. In May 1945, she was recognized and arrested while trying to board a train. At the Stutthof trial in 1946, Jenny Barkman denied all crimes while flirting with the guards and showing more concern with her hair than with the charges. Witnesses were received with laughter. Her lawyer argued insanity, an argument rejected by the tribunal. Her last recorded words before the sentence were, "Life is really a great pleasure, and pleasure usually does not last long." Sentenced to death, no remorse expressed at any point in the proceedings. 4 months. That was the time Elizabeth Becker spent at Stutthof before the camp was evacuated. It was enough to participate in selections for the gas chamber with the same arbitrary criteria as any veteran guard. She was the youngest among the 5 who would be sentenced to death for the camp. At the Stutthof trial in 1946, Elizabeth Becker admitted to having selected at least 30 women for the gas chamber. 30 names, 30 deaths, she acknowledged out loud before the tribunal. The court considered reducing the sentence due to the short time of service. The Polish president refused the clemency request. The argument was the same the survivors had been making for months. 4 months were more than enough to commit crimes that demanded an effective response from justice. Before Stutthof, Wanda Kloth had worked at a jam factory in Gdansk. There was nothing in her history that suggested what would come. At Stutthof, she beat prisoners regularly and selected sick women for the gas chamber. What she herself would describe as a routine of daily violence. Survivors identified her with precision at the trials. Each testimony described the same acts, the same locations, the same woman without hesitation. At the Stutthof trial, Wanda Kloth did not deny the beatings. She admitted to beating at least 2 prisoners per day, and did so with apparent pride. telling the tribunal she was very intelligent and very dedicated to her work. The judges sat in silence. Kloth did not seem to understand that she was describing torture as professional achievements. Her confession became one of the most cited documents in studies on the psychology of female perpetrators. There was no remorse. There was explicit satisfaction. She needed income. Her husband had been called to the front. Her son was a newborn. That is how Gerda Steinhoff answered the SS advertisement in 1944, and in less than a year she became Oberaufseherin, chief supervisor of the women's camp at Stutthof, with a Reich Medal for her services. She supervised the appels, applied collective punishments, and actively participated in the selections that sent women to the gas chamber, without documented hesitation. At the Stutthof trial in 1946, Gerda Steinhoff was accused of participating in selections for the gas chamber and of commanding punishments that resulted in deaths. Survivors identified her with precision. The court recognized her as a central figure in the violent structure of the women's camp. She was sentenced to death. At Biskupia Gorka, she would be hanged alongside the other four. The youngest of them had arrived at Stutthof that same year, also in her early 20s, also with no criminal record. She was 23 years old when she arrived at Stutthof in August 1944. Within a few months, Ewa-Paradis gained a reputation for using the whip at appels, ordering collective punishments, and individually humiliating prisoners, choosing women from the ranks for exposure to the cold without clothing for hours. She participated in the selections for the gas chamber. Her trajectory repeated the pattern documented in every camp. An ordinary woman transformed into a systematic perpetrator by the system that recruited and rewarded her. At the Stutthof trial in 1946, Ewa-Paradis was accused of participating in selections for the gas chamber and of inflicting torture during appels. She was 25 years old on the date of the trial and was sentenced to death. Her story showed something the archives confirmed repeatedly. The cruelty in the camps did not come only from hardened veterans, it also came from young women with no criminal record who simply answered an advertisement and said yes. On July 4th, 1946, on the hill of Biskupia Gorka, the 5 women were taken in the same truck: Jenny Barkman, Elizabeth Becker, Wanda Kloth, Gerda Steinhoff, and Ewa-Paradis, ages between 22 and 36. Different backgrounds, the same camp, the same crimes, the same fate. One by one, they were placed standing with the rope around their neck attached to the gallows above. The truck moved forward. 200,000 people watched in silence. It was Poland saying out loud what the camps had done and who had done it. Hildegard Lockhart remained in Germany under her real name for decades and was only tried in the 1970s. At Majdanek, Polish prisoners called her Bloody Brigida, Krwawa Brigida. She was known for beating with a whip during appels and for selecting weakened women for the gas chamber. After Majdanek, she served at Auschwitz and subcamps. With the end of the war, she stayed in Germany and was only tried in the 1970s at the Majdanek trial in Dusseldorf. Erna Petry was the wife of an SS officer in occupied Poland. She was not an official guard, nor did she hold a formal rank. In 1943, she spotted 6 Jewish children, between 6 and 12 years old, who had escaped from a transport to an extermination camp and hidden near her house. Petry took the children inside and gave them food. Then she led them to a grove and shot them one by one with her personal pistol. In 1962, she was tried in East Germany and sentenced to life in prison. Herta Botha arrived at Ravensbrück in 1942 and was transferred to Stutthof, where she became known as the sadist of Stutthof. She participated in selections, beat prisoners, and supervised forced labor under lethal conditions. With the Nazi collapse in 1945, she accompanied the death marches, prisoners forced to walk hundreds of miles in the Polish winter. Many froze to death in the snow. Botha was sentenced to 10 years at the Belsen trial. She was released from prison in 1951. She lived until the year 2000. Ruth Closius-Neudeck served at Ravensbrück and became Oberaufseherin, chief supervisor. She supervised the camp's gas chamber during 1944 and 1945. Survivors describe how she personally selected women for the chamber, announcing the selection in an indifferent voice as if it were an ordinary shift transfer. At the Ravensbrück trial, she was sentenced to death and hanged on May 3, 1947. Greta Bösel was a supervisor at Ravensbrück known for participating in the selections of the so-called unfit, prisoners considered incapable of working, sent to die. In her own records, she described some of these women as useless, who should be excised from the system. This dehumanizing language was standard in internal reports. Nazism transformed extermination into bureaucracy. Those responsible described mass murder as the disposal of unproductive resources. The prisoners of Ravensbrück were subjected to medical experiments by SS doctors, with the full logistical participation of the Aufseherinnen. The guards were responsible for selecting the women designated for the procedures, generally surgeries without anesthesia on leg bones or deliberate infection of open wounds with bacteria. Survivors described the guards who selected them with the same precision with which they described the doctors who operated on them. There was no confusing the faces. With the approach of the Allies in 1944 and 1945, the SS began evacuating the camps. Prisoners were forced to march hundreds of miles in winter toward camps in the interior of Germany. The conditions were lethal: hunger, cold, and bullets for those who could not continue. The Aufseherinnen supervised columns of weakened women on these marches. Some of the greatest documented atrocities occurred during the evacuations, far from the camps and the archives of the Nazi system. Ravensbrück was the only concentration camp of the Reich where the administration was almost entirely female. The Aufseherinnen did not merely guard the prisoners, they managed the entire operation of the camp, from food distribution to disciplinary punishments and selections for forced labor. This level of direct control made every decision a documented individual responsibility. None of them could claim ignorance about what happened to the women selected. In addition to beating and selecting, some Aufseherinnen acted as informants inside the camps. They reported to the SS prisoners who hoarded hidden food, attempted to communicate with others, or simply demonstrated minimal resistance. A report could result in immediate transfer to the gas chamber, internment in the bunker, or summary execution by firing squad. This role of active surveillance multiplied the reach of terror. The prisoners could not trust one another, as any one of them could be being watched by a plainclothes guard. At Ravensbrück, one of the most documented punishments was confinement in the Stehbunker, cells so narrow that the prisoners could only stand. They remained there for days, without food, without water, and unable to sit or lie down. The Aufseherinnen decided who entered and for how long they stayed. Survivors describe women who came out of the Stehbunker with necrotic feet from being unable to move. Some died inside. The guards recorded the confinement time on forms as routine administrative procedure. Louise Dance served at Auschwitz, Malchow, and other camps. Survivors describe her personally shooting prisoners who tried to escape or who simply stopped walking during the evacuation marches. In 1946, she was sentenced to death in Poland, a sentence later commuted to life in prison. She was released from prison in 1956 and lived until 1996 in Germany without ever being retried. Her case illustrates something the archives confirm repeatedly. Shooting defenseless prisoners was a tolerated practice. For the prisoners, waking up meant calculating which guard was on duty that day. Certain guards were predictable in their brutality. Others were more dangerous precisely because they were unpredictable. They could walk past you without looking, or they could pull you from the line for no visible reason. Survivors described the constant mental exercise of anticipating the guards' moods, adjusting their pace, avoiding eye contact. Physical violence was one part of the system. Permanent fear was another. When the war ended, the challenge for the Allied tribunals was to transform thousands of individual stories of horror into functional legal proceedings. The Aufseherinnen had committed crimes in camps spread across several countries before witnesses who survived by chance in structures created to leave no traces. Prosecuting these crimes required new legal principles. And it required courage from the survivors who needed to relive every detail before judges and the perpetrators themselves. The Nuremberg trials, begun in November 1945, established the principle of individual responsibility for war crimes. Participating in a criminal system as a subordinate did not exempt anyone from personal guilt. This principle was applied unevenly. High-ranking figures were prioritarily tried at Nuremberg, while the Aufseherinnen were prosecuted in national trials of the Allied countries, with criteria and rigor that varied significantly between jurisdictions. The trials of the Aufseherinnen were geographically fragmented. The British tried the guards of Bergen-Belsen, the Americans, those of Dachau, the Poles, those of Stutthof and Auschwitz. Germany tried some of the cases decades later. This fragmentation generated serious inconsistencies. Identical crimes received completely different sentences depending on the tribunal, and some guards escaped simply for being in the wrong occupation zone when the war ended. The standard defense of the Aufseherinnen at the trials followed a consistent script: obedience to superior orders, ignorance about the destinations of the selected, absence of real alternatives. The British and American tribunals rejected these arguments when confronted with detailed survivor testimonies. The principle was clear: the order does not nullify individual responsibility for the crime. This principle would later form the foundation of contemporary international humanitarian law as a legal basis. Of the approximately 500 women who served as guards in the Nazi camps, fewer than 100 were convicted of war crimes. The majority returned to Germany or Austria and lived decades in anonymity. Some changed their names, others kept their real names, relying on collective forgetting. For the survivors who recognized them on the streets and in markets, crossing paths with their torturers in everyday life was a specific and silent form of horror. Without a trial, without any consequence. Nazi hunter. Simon Wiesenthal argued that women were frequently underestimated by post-war investigators as minor accomplices. This underestimation was, in itself, a gender prejudice. The idea that women could not be autonomous perpetrators prevented the systematic investigation of their responsibilities. For Wiesenthal, the Aufseherinnen were not accomplices. They were full perpetrators. This distinction mattered for the correct application of justice and for the historical record. In 1984, West Germany extended the statute of limitations for murder crimes connected to National Socialism. The measure was a response to pressure from survivor groups. It arrived late. Many of the main perpetrators had already died. Others were too old to be effectively tried. The legal instrument existed, but decades of impunity had already done their work. The survivors carried the weight of a silence that the democratic state took too long to break. In 2015, a former Auschwitz guard named Hilde Michnia was tried at 95 years old, one of the last proceedings of this type in German history. The case generated debate. Was there any point in trying someone so elderly so long after? The answer from the survivors still alive was always the same. Yes, not for punishment, but for historical record. The trial was not about the old woman entering the courtroom. It was about the 19-year-old young woman who had crossed the ramp of Auschwitz decades earlier. The names of Irma Grese, Ilse Koch, Hermine Braunsteiner, Dorothea Binz, and Maria Mandl entered history as documented cases of human cruelty when the system legitimizes and rewards it. Behind each notorious name were hundreds of less visible women, equally responsible, who never answered for their acts. The difference between those who appear in this script and those who do not was, many times, merely a matter of geographic luck in the post-war period.